it's my pleasure as the Africa Director, my name is Nina Willen, to invite you to this seminar that's called Prospects for Dialogue in Central Sahel. And it's a seminar that is organized around a recent Folke Bernadotte Academy report that has been written by 3 authors who I will present in a little bit. And the topic, I think, has never been more timely than today, because this is something that we've spoken about during the past few years, since the wave of coups in the Sahel, about how could possibly there be more dialogue with the Sahel countries. And on that topic, Dr. Ivan Gishawa, who is the senior researcher at the Bonn International Center of Conflict Studies, has, together with Dr. Jenny Lorentzen, who is online with us here from the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, senior research fellow in the research group for peace, conflict, and development, and also Dr. Cindy Mariko from the University of Kurukan Fuga, who is also a researcher who's focusing on conflict resolution, governance, and regional integration. Together, they have written this report that's investigating the prospects for dialogue along 3 different arenas, or 3 levels. First, the regional diplomatic dialogue, and then dialogue with the jihadist insurgents, and then the participation of women in conflict resolutions and national dialogue processes. And we're going to organize this seminar as we usually do. In a little bit, I'm going to hand over the word to Dr. Pierre Bielkander, who is the Folke Bernadotte Academy representative, for a few introductory words as well. And after that, I'm handing it over to the lead author of the study, who is here in Brussels today, and who will then give a presentation of around 20 minutes before we open for a Q&A, where the other co-authors will also be able to answer questions from you and from me. I will be the facilitator, so I will take the privilege to ask some introductory questions, but I will make sure that you will have the time as well to ask questions, both online and here, of course. I should say that everything is under Chatham House rules, and that goes, of course, also for the ones who are online. So please make sure that whatever you take out, it's from the Q&A. You cannot attribute it to the person who said it. But of course, the study is online, and I would recommend that you download it and read it, because it's well worth a read. And now I'm handing over for a few minutes of explanation, perhaps, and context around the study to Per, who is in Sweden.
Thank you, Nina. Yes, great to see you, everyone, and thank you for sort of providing this space also to continue the discussion on the Sahel. So I think like many other sort of international partners, Sweden was active in the Sahel, in Mali and Burkina Faso. And FBA was in Mali a number of years, but had to leave. So we don't have any presence there anymore since a couple of years back. Unfortunately, we were trying to follow it. So I think this study was a way of actually trying to sort of still keep tabs on what's happening and maybe try to look at opportunities, because not only were there these coups in the region, but also you had deteriorating relationships between the neighboring countries. So the question is, how do you keep the channels of communication and dialogue open? And so we wanted to sort of look at this from different angles, and that's sort of a general background of how this study came about. And so I think our colleagues, researchers, will explain more how they went about it. But what we hope is really that this report will stir debate and thinking around how can the international community, how can the region continue to be engaged because we believe in multilateral relations and bilateral engagements and not in isolation. And so what are the entry points, what are the inroads, and what are the peaceful means of engagement, because we are on this part of the playing field. It's the peaceful, peace building, conflict resolution dialogue that we're talking about, and how can we expand this space in this current environment. So those are some thoughts. I'll leave the details for our colleagues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Per, for those introductory words and for contextualizing this study a little bit. I also wanted to say before I hand over to Ivan is that you can, of course, ask questions in the chat, and I will try to make sure that I read them afterwards during the Q&A, but you can do that continuously. And now I'm going to hand over the word to you, Ivan, and we're going to share Ivan's presentation on here. So make a sound if you can't see it. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much, Nina. Thank you to the large attendance. It's very impressive, and it seems the room is full of very specialized people who certainly have plenty of fruitful remarks and questions to make. So I'm not going to spend too much time on the presentation of the report. The report is available online. I'm not necessarily assuming that you have all read the 57 pages, I think, but I would perhaps just briefly walk you through our approach and our main findings. This is a collective work jointly led by myself and Jenny Lorenzen, as you said earlier, Nina, and Sidi Mariko. Thank you, FBA, for sponsoring the work and being very patient with us. And congrats, Nina, who has a book out today. The first most comprehensive book on foreign intervention in the Sahel is out today. So I think this little moment of promotion is not displaced or inappropriate in this context. I'm sure there are plenty of potential readers in the room. All right, let me start with some inspiration behind the research that we have conducted. The very basic idea behind the report is that after the coup, things have quite dramatically changed in the Sahel region when it comes, sorry for the background noise, when it comes to tools and instruments of making peace stabilization. So this is our very basic starting point. We claim that the coups have represented a critical junctures for processes such as stabilization. Stabilization before the coup was very much supported by the international community and Western countries in particular, and took many different forms. By definition, stabilization is a very, very polysemic term. There's plenty you could put under this term, and dialogue was part of what the stabilization complex was encouraging, even though perhaps it's what was not enough, because one of the reasons perhaps why these processes didn't work as expected has to do precisely with the over-reliance on military intervention and perhaps sort of wrong balance between processes of dialogue and the military effort. But that's at least how things used to work, and we can have a fairly accurate picture of what existed before the coup. And we were not clear, at least when the project started, about what sort of measures have replaced the stabilization process as we knew it. So that was the original question. Like, we know what is lost, what does not exist anymore. We don't know necessarily what is happening today after the coup, and specifically with regards to dialogue happening on different levels, which I'm going to detail in a minute. So that's the first question. Second thing, or second observation we make, is that even though concretely we're not so clear about what has been going on since the coup in terms of dialogue, we know pretty much which paradigm is somehow shaping the policies of the Central Sahel countries that are studied in this work, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, but with perhaps more emphasis on Mali. And this paradigm is what we call the sovereignist paradigm. Again, it's a fairly polysemic term. There's plenty you can put under this paradigm, but basically, we take seriously the claim made by these countries that they don't necessarily need external support for many of the problems that they have to deal with. And we hear this frequently in the discourses of the leaders from these countries, that they need to find their own solutions to the problems that they face, and also take back control for processes that they think used to be overly influenced by external powers, and particularly former colonial powers such as France. Well, you know the rhetoric. And with this in mind, like, we have a lens to study what has emerged after the coup when it comes to processes of dialogue. All right. Now, how did we work in this project? We chose first 3 areas of dialogue, which we think are particularly topical, but we also have like very basic constraints. Like, we cannot cover the whole field. And so we also trusted our own expertise, areas of specialization in the team, and decided to go for 3 types of dialogue. First, regional dialogue, like how the Central Sahel countries relate with their immediate neighbors, and particularly the ECOWAS. Second, dialogue with jihadist insurgents. We know that some forms of dialogue existed before the coup. It's kind of a mystery what has been happening after. We wanted to explore this question further, whether in particular, like, dialogue had completely stopped, and if it still exists, on which level. And we have a final element, area of dialogue that we wanted to pay attention to, which is the participation of women in the peace process. The women and peace and security agenda was central to processes of dialogue initiated, particularly as part of the Accord pour la paix et la réconciliation, so the so-called Accord d'Alger in Mali. There was a strong WPS element in these processes. This process has officially been stopped by the authorities of Mali, but that does not necessarily mean that authorities of Mali have completely ruled out and dismissed the participation of women in national dialogue, and that's what we are investigating in this report. So we have these 3 areas that we systematically review, and we look at what used to happen before, look at what is happening today, and try to offer a little assessment, detail the challenges associated with the different areas of dialogue that we study, and even propose fairly generic recommendations for the different partners. So this work didn't involve primary data. Well, it involved primary data collection, but not necessarily on site. You know, it's complicated to do research in the Central Sahel right now. But what we did to sustain our view, and generally speaking to like elaborate our findings is organize online round table with a lot of different actors from the Sahel, whose names have not been disclosed because we really wanted the conversations to be like as open and free as possible. So their names don't appear in the reports, but they are the primary contributors to the findings of the report. We arranged 3 separate round tables, and one actually happened in person, the 2 others online, and make people talk around like questions that we had for this report. We extracted the key remarks and findings from these conversations, which eventually appear as the main findings of the report. So it's not a desk-based job, right? It's based on Sahelian perspectives on the situation happening in the 3 Central Sahel countries today. That's an important thing to bear in mind. One more thing to say, perhaps before I move to the substance. Yeah, there are some aspects that we didn't necessarily cover. Key aspects of dialogue, for example, would concern the former secessionist groups which joined the Alger peace agreements and which became secessionist groups again after the official end of the Alger peace agreements. This aspect of the relationship between these groups and central authorities in Bamako is not like fully covered in the reports. And yeah, there are deliberate omissions for the reasons I explained later, and we decided to restrict the scope of the work to these 3 areas that I just mentioned. So we can perhaps share the screen now and go through the main observation. I hope you can see what's on the screen. It's basically a very synthetic way to represent the changes that form our main puzzle. We place what used to happen before the coups under the liberal paradigm category, and which is the column on the left, and the column on the right represents what we see happening under what we call sovereignist paradigm. And we do this in the 3 areas that the report covers. So it's fairly self-explanatory. I'm not going to paraphrase what's on the screen, but yeah, we hope that this table captures the main changes that have been observed in the region when it comes to processes of dialogue in our respective areas of interest. And in any case, we structure our findings around these changes, try to explain why the changes happen, but also try to offer an assessment of what mechanisms have replaced the mechanisms that used to exist. So I can briefly now move to some of the key findings that we have. Yes, thank you, Nina, for one more. Okay, one more click, perhaps. Yeah, when it comes to prospects of regional dialogue, we have a series of findings. Basically, our main finding, which is not necessarily very surprising, is that dialogue is harder to find these days because typically these coup leaders come from the military ranks, and it's no surprise that they privilege force or some muscular ways of dealing with the problems that they face. So as a result, you can imagine that automatically the dialogue processes are now pushed in the back seat. So that could be the shallow perspective that we offer on the situation, which is not completely untrue. Why is it not completely untrue? It's because we still found in our respective areas of interest some margins for dialogue. Typically, when it comes to regional dialogue, which is the part that CD has worked on the most, and there will be questions, I'm sure, for him after my presentation. What we found when it comes to regional dialogue is that even though we have like very bitter relationships between IOS countries, so this new confederation that the Central Sahel countries have formed, and ECOWAS, which they are no longer part of, even though the relationships are relatively bitter and we have like very strong words thrown at each other across borders, there are still actors within ECOWAS in particular that have the possibility to talk to everyone on the IOS side and on the ECOWAS side. Typically, Togo is one country which has some form of diplomatic capital that works on both sides of the cleavage. We also go slightly beyond relationships with ECOWAS, talk about some relationships happening between Mali and Mauritania, Mali and Algeria. We see that, in fact, with the creation of the IOS, we have a sort of bilateralization of diplomatic relationships happening. And instead of looking at blocks, it's often more productive and interesting to look at how individual countries have revamped, reshaped their relationships with their immediate neighbors. There are some interesting cases that we discuss about Mauritania, which is in fact like making us relatively optimistic, as opposed to, for example, what we observed between Algeria and Mali. One more thing, of course, which again is not really a surprise, the populations themselves entertain all sorts of channels to exchange ideas, goods across borders. And in fact, even if central authorities tend to have strong words for central authorities among their neighbors, populations continue to exchange and are in fact like keeping relationships alive. And it's a sort of sad thing to realize like the discrepancy that exists between what's happening at the very top level of decision making and grassroots demographic trade, cultural exchanges in the borderlands. So that's what we figured out about the regional dialogue. I'm going to speed up a little bit. When it comes to dialogue with jihadist groups, we have like a series of interesting findings. Dialogue was not officially open with jihadists under the old stabilization regime promoted by Western actors, but it was tolerated at the local level. High-level dialogue was not considered at all, but at least local dialogue was happening, and it was happening for very pragmatic and important reasons. You know certainly that JNIM, so this important jihadist organization operating in the region, is putting a lot of pressure on individual communities, particularly in central Mali, but also in Burkina Faso, to impose the Sharia law, and it's basically using all sorts of coercive instruments to obtain compliance from communities. One of these instruments, very powerful, very damaging, is the siege, the blocus, as people know it in the Sahel. under when the MINUSMA was still present, this UN peacekeeping mission, MINUSMA was not officially mediating between jihadists and communities, but was somehow facilitating some types of dialogue that could lead to so-called pacte de survie, so survival pacts, to make sure at least that populations could continue their economic activities, to make sure that farmers could continue to cultivate their lands, etc. And so we had a series, in fact, dozens of so-called survival pacts happening before the coups, and that were helping populations resume with their regular economic activities. Of course, these pacts had a downside, which was to comply with the terms of the jihadist rule, right? And women in particular were heavily hit and comparatively more hit than men, perhaps, with times of bans that jihadists were imposing. After the coup, these survival pacts continued to exist, but were increasingly criminalized. Basically, the military regime would consider anyone talking to the jihadists as complicit with the jihadists, even though this talk and this dialogue was guided, driven exclusively by survival concerns. So we ended up with very difficult situations for populations being caught basically between state repression and pressure put on them by the jihadists in places where practically the state is not offering enough support for the population. So this is a big change that has been happening, and the result is that dialogue continues under the radar, but under heavier pressure now from the military authorities. This may change because we have a situation right now in Bamako that we may discuss in the Q&A, and which could be a sort of update to the report. And I'm referring here to the economic blockade that the jihadists are imposing on Bamako right now, which started after we released the report. All right. Next slide, perhaps. Okay, I'm already 20 minutes into my talk. Here, perhaps, is the area where things have not dramatically changed, even though, and Jenny will rectify me if I'm wrong, even though some elements of the WPS agenda have been somehow pushed in the back seat. The national dialogue that was initiated by the military authorities in Mali after the coup, called the Dialogue intermalien pour la paix et la réconciliation, which is one other round of like national discussions around national cohesion. This dialogue involved women who were part of the steering committee. Of course, they were perhaps chosen in a fairly ad hoc manner, but that applies to any actor from the civil society that was involved in this process. But still, you had an explicit effort by the authorities to include female voices in these processes. Now, what has been lost, of course, is the presence of women that were participating, even though in a fairly frustrating way, in the Alger peace process. Like, the presence of women was integral, at least on paper, to this process. And with the disappearance of this process, you also have the disappearance of a forum, an arena for women to express their concerns. So these are like the main observations that we make. Going perhaps to move now to the policy recommendations, which are too many to detail, but I will finish with one remark perhaps that concerns the regional dialogue dimension.
Regional one, yeah.
Yes, that's the last point.
This one?
Yeah, so I'm not going to review all the recommendations, but it's just a remark in passing, and that has to do with the present day situation and the crisis that we see unfolding in Mali right now, and that affects Bamako in very serious and worrying ways. I was discussing this matter with a colleague yesterday, and we both reached the conclusion that currently Bamako is facing a massive challenge. It's under huge economic pressure due to this blockade on camion citerne and gas supplies imposed by JNIM. And we don't see so much solidarity coming from neighboring countries. So we stress in the report that the dialogue between IOS countries and ECOWAS is difficult, bumpy, but still alive in some ways. But there's probably not enough happening on this level. And the situation that we see unfolding right now in Bamako could actually be an opportunity to somehow reopen discussions, because what is happening in Bamako right now should alarm everyone in the region and beyond, including Western capitals, Brussels, and London, Paris, whatever. So yeah, I mean, that would be a sort of recommendation, but also an observation that I feel that international community, if the term still makes sense, is bizarrely very silent with the situation, about the situation that we are observing right now. That may require perhaps a little bit of solidarity coming from countries which have been kicked out perhaps by these sovereignist leaders. But yeah, perhaps in times of crisis, these things should be buried so that dialogue resumes. I'm ending here. Thank you very much.
There.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for a rich presentation that I think summarized quite well. Of course, not everything, because it's a report of 54 pages that I think you mentioned that I do, and I reiterate that I do think that it's definitely worth reading for those of you who haven't yet. And of course, time is ticking, but I think that I do have the time to ask you a few questions to the co-authors of this report. And I will try to group them into the three dimensions that you have, or the levels that you have mentioned, but I will ask you not to answer the questions now, and then I'll open up the floor so that we have a few more questions. But I think the first one is then about the regional dialogue, and that question would then go to Mariko more specifically. In many ways, I think that the AES is a very fragile confederation. If we call it a confederation, we've seen that they sometimes take the same decision, they sometimes have the same foreign policy, but at the same time, they also have bilateral relations with other states, and they don't follow completely. On social media, they're very cohesive, but in practice, it's not always the case. We know that there was, for example, the flight suspension, or the closure of the airspace after the drone incident with Mali and Algeria. That was not followed up with Burkina Faso and Niger. And there has been other incidents where you can see that it's not a completely coherent confederation. At the same time, it's also a confederation or an alliance that has the prospects of maybe expanding. We've seen that Togo has made several remarks about maybe joining, and then it has been coming back on that statement, but it's still like, we have seen Chad is also talking about it. Senegal has been in this position where it's in between ECOWAS and AES, and I think it's pretty clear that they would not join it, but there has been discussions about expanding AES. So we have this very paradoxical situation with the AES. It's both expanding somewhat, and it's very fragile. So I'm wondering a little bit about the prospects for that, how you would see it, Mariko, given your focus on that. And also, in my discussions with people from the region, there is some who say this cannot last. At some point, they will all come back to ECOWAS. But I feel the longer this lasts, the less likely that is the case. And I would like to hear how you feel it, if we're going to continue with this sort of bilateral puzzle with some relations changing continuously between the different states. So that's for the regional dimension. For the jihadist dimension, and here I'm also, it's a question that I think will touch both on Jenny's expertise and yours, Ivan, and that is that you also mentioned that this, once there is a dialogue with the jihadists, it is extremely difficult for the local population, and it also means that somehow you bend to the rules of the jihadists, so you are increasing their power. And this is especially difficult for women. And I would like to remind you, and Jenny and me have worked now for 3 years together on a research project on gender and women in SSR in Mali and Niger. So we do have a history of working on that topic. And women are not a minority group. We're talking about 50% of the population that then would have harder conditions under jihadist rule. So I'm thinking about this question. I would ask probably to both Ivan and Jenny. More specifically to Ivan, I would like to ask you about the jihadist strategies that we've seen unfolding during the last few weeks with the blockade that you rightly mentioned is extremely alarming. And I think also something that has gone under the radar, surprisingly, as you said, in many Western capitals, even though this should be something that's on the top of the agenda, not necessarily prompting France to return, but definitely something that should be up on the agenda. And then finally, a question for Jenny then. I think that we're talking about dialogues, and we're talking about dialogues with specific groups like jihadis, we're talking about regional, and then all of a sudden we're talking about 50% of the population again. And somehow I'm also wondering, like, not how that fit in, but like how do you see that that in this broader context? And I would like to ask, how do you think that external actors like NGOs could engage with that? Because we know that the women, peace and security agenda is right now very much in the shadow of everything else. It's not considered as part of the power politics. It's not a priority. It's always left at the side, as it's always been, but even more now. So how do you see the future for different organizations to engage and try to increase that without obstructing possibilities for dialogue with the Sahelian countries? So these are my questions, and now I'm going to open up for I think we don't need to share them anymore. Okay, yeah, no, it's fine like that. And now I'm going to open up for questions first from the audience here in the room. That's the privilege of coming all the way into Egmont in the middle of a storm. I'm sorry. And then I will let the authors answer, and then I'll take the questions online. But I'm going to take 3 questions here. And in the meantime, I hope that the authors are taking notes. Yes. And please just say your name and your institution before.
Yes, hello. I am Jérôme Rivière. I work for the European Parliament Secretariat, ACP unit, so Africa, Caribbean, Pacific. Our role is actually to implement the parliamentary dimension of the Samoa Agreement that has replaced the Cotonou Agreement. And as a matter of fact, when we talk about Central Sahel countries, these countries have actually signed the Samoa Agreement. So it's like a binding agreement between the 2 sides. I mean, in spite of difficult relationship with some member states, I would just like to highlight the fact that these countries will have a seat in the upcoming Africa EU Parliamentary Assembly that will gather next year in Africa. My question is about dialogue, actually, because what is dialogue and what's the purpose of the dialogue? I mean, we're talking of dialogue at different levels with different kind of stakeholders and probably with different objectives. So I think this is something that perhaps you could clarify. because I mean, we're talking of civil war basically happening in these countries, and what would be the positive result of this dialogue in our views? And I think there are questions related to values and to interest of those countries, and also the fact that basically, I mean, we are talking of free dictatorships who are perhaps having a dialogue with jihadists for whatever reason, whatever objective. But perhaps it would be good if you could actually clarify this concept. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's an essential question. I think it's mentioned in the report, but I think you can also expand on that perhaps. Is there any more question in, yeah?
Thank you very much, Ivan, for the rich presentation and for the report. I thank the whole team. My name is Mohammed Salah. I'm from the OIC mission to the EU. And
Speak up a little bit.
okay, my name is Mohammed Salah. I'm from the OIC mission to the EU. And my question is about the possibility of constructive dialogue with the leadership of those countries. Can this take us anywhere positive? I mean, if there is no constructive dialogue between the leadership of the three countries and the international community, would any policy recommendations be fruitful? And my second question is the role of religious and traditional leaders in dialogue. If of course you have any connections with them online or in person, do they make any impact on the ground? Thank you.
Thank you.
Can
So
you just repeat this one?
The role of religious and traditional
Right.
leaders in dialogue.
I think we have had so far quite concrete questions that should be very easy for you to answer to all of the authors. I think I will end the question round here, and I'm going to hand over the floor to the co-authors. Perhaps I can't see Mariko right now, but I would start then by giving the floor to Jenny for about the 5 minutes, 5-minute answer to the questions.
Thank you, Nina, and thank you also for organizing this meeting. I think it's as has been said, a very important moment to discuss these issues. And also thank you to Ivan for presenting our work so well. So I'll start. I think I will address your question, Nina, mainly, and try to explain a little bit why we think that the topic of women's participation is important when we discuss prospects for dialogue. And while yes, we have regional dialogue and we have dialogue with jihadists, and then we have women's participation, but the focus of the section on women's participation is also on the peace processes and national dialogue process in Mali. And I think that it was also important to include these processes in the report, given that they have been so important for what has happened, and for the also the role of dialogue in, especially in Mali then. But of course, yes. So, and in terms of women's participation, I would like to also just highlight that well, women were actually marginalized also in the Algiers process, right? So it's not a success story necessarily. It's not like we have moved from a success story to a sort of story of failure. And now I'm also going to talk based on what is in the report, which is focusing on these two processes. So if we stick to that for now, just to say that the Algiers process was also very challenging in terms of inclusion for women, also for other groups, of course. But then towards the end, the Algiers process became it received a lot of attention because of the introduction of a gender quota in the Agreement Monitoring Committee. However, this happened at a time when the peace process was already failing, right? And only 3 years later, the authorities declared this process dead. And I think then we have a process that is has followed, which is the process for the DIMPR, the dialogue, inter-Malian dialogue. And this process falls very clearly under the sovereignist paradigm that Ivan laid out for you in his introduction presentation. And what you can also read about this in the report, of course, but what I find quite interesting is that with this regime that has sort of rejected a lot of his Western partners and their values in their official communications about the inter-Malian dialogue, they have sort of kept up the rhetorics on women's participation, and women have been included as members of steering committees, or women's organizations have also been able to engage with the process. But then, of course, the process itself also has many flaws and excluded a lot of actors. So of course, then also women's participation is at best partial, right? But then, and also, of course, if to try to answer a bit your question, like, yes, the engagement of external actors and the international community with this process has been very limited and very challenging, and I think the possibilities for that type of engagement are very small at the moment. But in this roundtable that we organized, and also in interviews with women's activists and NGOs in Bamako, what they say is that you can still work at the local level with local conflict resolution and local dialogue processes, and here women can play a role and often do play a role, right? And I think it's important to understand, or to sort of, this is the message basically that I wanted to bring also, because I think these are the processes that we can now support, and also to remember that women in Mali and women's movements and NGOs have suffered enormously from the cuts that we have seen in development aid and funding, as well as the sort of with the international community to a large degree also leaving the country, right? So they are surviving on voluntary contributions and very limited funding, but they are still there, but they do feel quite abandoned, I think, by the international community, but their work is important, and they do, and there is still a possibility to continue to build their capacity to support them in local processes. And I think also here is what can NGOs do, for example, today? It's supporting these organizations and these local processes that are already there, so that the competence and the resources are there when there are other processes coming, for hopefully later, you know. And then also Mali does have some frameworks. They have a national action plan for women, peace and security, which probably is no longer very relevant or very much implemented. But I think also women's organizations in Mali will continue to engage with their authorities, but mainly maybe at the local level on these issues.
Thank you, Jenny, for that answer. I think just a follow-up question that I don't want you to answer now. I'm wondering just if the fact that the military governments continue to include women in these very promoting women's inclusion, if that's also not a response and a signal to the jihadists, to make a contrast with what the jihadists are imposing, to make sure that they keep their stance as working against jihadists, rather than that they're joining the Western discourse. But that's a question for later. Mariku, maybe if you would like to take 5 minutes as well to answer the questions, and then we will give the floor to Ivan for a few minutes too.
Okay, thanks a lot, Nina. and good morning, colleagues. Thank
Is
you.
it possible to speak a little bit louder, Mariko? Thank you.
Is it better now?
Much better.
Great. Okay. So thanks everyone, and thanks to Ivan for the presentation, which reflect where the work. And coming back to the questions, I think I'm seeing like two questions from my side. The first one being what you, Nina, you asked it. My perspective on the fragility, but also the potential expanding of EAS. Well, you asked it my perspective, and I know what it means. Well, I think my perspective is that EAS is quite a block, I will say an opportunistic block, because this is not an initiative which was planned earlier, because it's mostly a result of ECOWAS ambivalent actions, especially in Niger, because when ECOWAS threatened to intervene militarily in Niger, that is where, knowing that if ECOWAS had succeeded to intervene militarily in Niger, would mean that the same could happen in Mali or in Burkina. So those countries find themselves in an opportunistic unions, you see. So this is not something which was planned, although we had other initiatives like the initiative around Liptako Goma, but this is something which is which we are really not seeing the results in terms of development or even in terms of any form of cooperation, but it was there. But the EAS came mainly because of the action of ECOWAS in Niger. So that's why I'm talking about an opportunistic confederation or initiative. So that opportunistic initiative explains its fragility, because there is nothing concretely planned in terms of policy coherence, or even in terms of institution building, because EAS is mainly on paper. You know, it's mainly something which is carried out by those political militaries. And although it has had an impressive echo within the populations. So another reasons, or what may explain from my view, the fact that it has the potential of expanding, which is true. And I think we can see that from different perspectives, from a political perspective, from economic perspective, and also from a Pan-Africanism perspective. The political perspective is that when we take countries like Togo, even Senegal, or even Mauritania, although Mali had diplomatic, at a time, severe diplomatic tension with Mauritania, but the interest in AS lies also in the fact that those countries, they don't have access to sea, as all of us we know. So Togo is willing, perhaps Togo may join EAS so that those countries will have access to sea through its ports, just like Senegal. And we know that Mali is the first client of Dakar in terms of transport of goods. Even we can also talk about Guinea. But also another reasons why EAS may expand is also, we know that these young militaries people who are leading countries in the Sahel, although they are not legitimate in court, but I think they are having they have had a kind of echoes within the youth populations across many countries and regions in Africa. In fact, I was even surprised to be informed in 2020 by a friend from Zimbabwe when the first coup happened in 2020. That shows how there is a kind of scrutiny from the population, mostly from youth, on what is happening in these countries. So I think some of those countries also, their interest lies in that aspect also, because they will better to show a kind of alignment to these countries so that to protect themselves within their own territory or nations. That is some of my perspective on your question.
Thank you.
If I may say something on
About one more minute or two.
Okay. So someone asked it about dialogue in the interests and values, and especially the possibility or the potential for a constructive dialogue. I think to me, these two questions are they are the same, because the possibility of a constructive dialogue, I think, depends on two major things, which is interest and values. When we see now Sahelian countries, there is a kind of confrontation in terms of interest and values between these countries and Western countries. So to me, perhaps what we should know, or what Westerner or the international community should also consider is, to take into consideration the reality on what is happening in these regions, because over the last decade, unfortunately, the international interventions did not bring the expected results. That is a fact. And I think what these countries need really today is a concrete help or a concrete cooperation which can help them contain this jihadism, because, and I think since the time of the former president of Mali, ATT, he has been asking for help, saying that any one country in the world cannot fight terrorism, and which is true. So, but very unfortunately, there were no consistent, help from neither the bloc, I mean the ECOWAS, but also the international community, which can really give concrete results. So thanks very much, and perhaps there will be more questions.
Thank you. We should maybe add also to the international community more broadly, or the Western that you mentioned, and ECOWAS, also the Russian support has not either been able to contain the jihadists, which we've seen the last 3 or 4 years in Mali. Just before I give the floor to Ivan, is also to say that I see that some of you have not been able to see the PowerPoint shared by Ivan, but it's the same images that you find in the report. So if you didn't already download it, then you can download it, and then you will see the images that were on his PowerPoint. So Ivan, about 5 minutes as well before we go for a second round of questions.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me start with the question, perhaps about the current strategy of the jihadists. It's kind of strange or difficult to really identify the moment when the regime decided to block access to gas citerns, like tanks, trucks. Yeah, I don't know what's the word exactly, but it happened, 6 weeks ago, perhaps a bit earlier, and it followed perhaps like local rationale, and eventually it escalated into something very serious, that perhaps surprised JNIM itself. Like they started imposing blockades or ambushing trucks, convoys coming to Bamako, and then realized that it was super effective as a way to increase the political pressure on Bamako. And I'm not saying it was improvised, because for many years, JNIM troops have pushed southwards. It's clear to everyone that they had plenty of cells, not very active, but not far from Bamako for a long, long time. And now these groups are being activated. And it doesn't need a lot of capacity for them to mobilize to ambush a convoy of trucks. But for the authorities to protect these convoys, it takes massive military capabilities that the authorities actually don't have, because they have generally deployed their troops further north or in central Mali as well. So JNIM, strategically speaking, tactically speaking, is doing something spectacular and also extremely effective. And of course, it goes way beyond just an economic blockade, because gas is central to all economic activities, and the shortage of gas translates potentially into political unrest, even perhaps tensions among the generals in power. So we don't know where this is going, and it's not clear what kind of response the authorities can offer right now, because again, you could see on a daily basis that trucks that come from Côte d'Ivoire, for example, are attacked. There was even a video released 2 days ago when one convoy had some aerial support. You see a helicopter flying above the trucks, but that doesn't stop JNIM combatants from carrying out the ambush and stopping everything. So it's a fairly complicated situation. And the thing is, there are many speculations around this issue. The end goal of JNIM might not necessarily be to sort of capture Bamako, because everyone knows that populations in Bamako are likely to be very hostile. You still have well-trained military in Bamako, so it's probably not through military means that JNIM expects to make Bamako fall. That wouldn't make much sense from a military tactical perspective. JNIM probably expects the unraveling of the authorities due to social unrest, political rivalries, and so that they can eventually sort of catch the low-hanging fruit. But they don't also have a very clear political agenda to deploy in case Bamako falls. So the day after is super complicated to envisage. There are many different scenarios going on that I would love to detail with all sorts of people, including policy makers. Some of them are completely wide and probably
Perhaps something for an Egmont policy brief?
No, I don't have the time, I'm sorry. No, we have possibly, I don't know. We can discuss this further, but yeah, that would be probably a long conversation. But everybody is speculating right now. But it's also a very serious situation, largely because we don't see how the authorities can get out of this, because the military vehicles need gas, right? So, and the supply of gas right now is 100% controlled by JNIM. It's a display of force that is absolutely massive. It is showing to people in Mali and beyond that, in fact, JNIM is, perhaps the most powerful player in Mali right now. Okay, now, having said that, there have been many occasions in the past where all the analysts, people like me, were thinking, all right, this government or this regime is on the verge of falling, and eventually they jump back on their feet. So I mean, let's not sort of make a prediction that might be disproved soon. So that's for the situation right now. And dialogue could be a way out of the situation. Now, which form of dialogue? Because what we say in the report is that engaging with the jihadists is likely to be quite complicated because the jihadists will set a very high bar. And now that the military situation is evolving in their favor, to their advantage, the bar will be even higher. So what are they going to ask from people in Mali is an open question. And again, we can speculate about what the possibilities are. Perhaps quickly, because your question about values interest has been addressed by CD. The role of local actors, religious actors, and traditional leaders. It's fascinating, like how the Sahel, how rich the Sahel is, with figures that we Westerners in Brussels don't know, but that are hugely influential on the ground. Now, the thing is, and in the peace studies, you have plenty of literature that celebrates like grassroots initiative, like bottom-up initiative, peace from below, whatever. It's been super fashionable in the past years. When you have, as you said, dictatorial regimes, like very heavy-handed military powers in place, I'm less optimistic about the capacity of these grassroots initiatives to deliver, because there will be a moment when you need the endorsement of the state, when being a fantastic Islamic scholar is not going to lead anywhere because somebody has guns somewhere and might point the gun at you, and that will be the end of the dialogue. Having said that, I think the Islamic idiom is hugely important and is the way to go and try to find out a governance system that may eventually accommodate the needs of parties that are now conflicting against each other at the moment. But if there's one language that is common to all these communities, it's the Islamic language. And we have examples from the occupation of Gao, for example, in 2012, when this imam that the jihadists like could not silence was talking on radio and like really making the jihadists feel ashamed for what they were doing, because the guy had the scholarship, had the knowledge, and could explain using the relevant references how wrong the jihadists were. And that generated a lot of support among the population and a lot of conversations that were using the idiom of the jihadists themselves. And that's the way to go. If there's one window to explore further, it's probably this one.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's interesting. But then again, and I will ask that question again to you, even if you might not have the time to answer about the women's role in that afterwards. But I'll wait with that one. If for those of you who are online, you can also see that Lena from the Folke Bernadotte Academy has posted the link to the report, so you can see the slides there. And now I'm going over to the questions that have been asked online, and then I'm opening up for one more from the floor, and that will be our final round of questions, unfortunately. The first question is about the percentage of hardcore Islamic fighters that we talk about in this part of the Sahel. And I think that you will have to think that one is particularly for Ivan, but I think that you will have to interpret it freely, because what is hardcore and in which part of the Sahel are we talking? But again, like I think that you could elaborate a bit on that one. And then it's one of the points that is very much on the table when we talk about the Sahel, and it's the disinformation. And if that was one of the topics that came up in any of the round table discussions, and I think it's relevant for all three dimensions: the regional, the women's participation, and the jihadist is this a phenomenon that you actually see an impact on the ground? And I'm not going to answer that question, but I can imagine that that's the case, or if it's only online. And then I'm opening up. So those are the two questions. And I think the second question could be answered very briefly by the three authors. And then I have a third one here.
Saloli, I work for the European Business Council for Africa, EBCAM, and I wanted to ask, I don't know if this is out of the scope of the report, so feel free to say that. If so far, let's say before the economic blockade imposed by Jenin, if this alliance of Central Sahel states have been engaging with other international actors in any dialogue that could be political, diplomatic, or economic as well, or military cooperation with any other international actor beside the West or the EU, etc. If you could expand on that, perhaps. Thank you.
I'm adding that just as precision that when we talked about the blockade, we obviously talked about Mali, but it has impacts beyond Mali as well in the region. And that comes to a fourth and final question, and that will also be directed to Ivan, is if there is a variation in the way that the three military regimes in the region are engaging with the jihadists. And that's, of course, somewhat covered in your report, but maybe you can elaborate on that again. And I will start on the opposite now, and I would like, perhaps now we have a limited amount of time, so maybe 2 minutes for Dr. Marco for the question about disinformation, and then I go over to Jenny, and I'll end with Ivan. So,
All right.
Dr. Marco.
Thanks again. But perhaps just a few words on this blockage, as Ivan and other colleagues mentioned. I think very unfortunately, this is a situation we are undergoing right now in Bamako. People have a lot of challenges to have access to fuel. And very unfortunately, it's even not only a matter of fuel, but also goods, foodstuffs, because we import most of our stuff from the neighboring countries. So it's not only a matter of fuel. And we are seeing a growing inflation, very unfortunately, which can bring us to what we don't know. But I think this is a current situation which is going on, and it's difficult to predict what will happen. That being said, I think the government is also working from its side. They have put in place a committee which has developed a plan in 3 phases, but let's just hope that it will work. Okay.
Can you just say the plan from what was the plan that the government had elaborated?
Yes, they have a plan, to secure tanker trucks and to secure also fuels. But we know few about the content of this plan for now, personally. Now coming to the matter of mis or disinformation, which is a reality in the Sahel right now. I was involved in a workshop in Dakar last week, which was on disinformation and misinformation. But as far as my sub-theme on regional diplomatic dialogue is concerned, unfortunately, we did not touch this phenomenon. And I think this is also one of the limitations of our study. And of course, we cannot cover everything. But this is a phenomenon which is a reality in Mali currently. We know that we know some associations, some activism that are funded by either Russia or other countries like Iran or whatever. So this is a reality. I will leave it to other colleagues. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Jenny, if you have 2-3 minutes.
Thank you, Nina. Yeah, I will do my best. I mean, obviously, this will be a bit on the surface because there's so much to say, but we cannot go into detail about everything. But I wanted to just respond to your follow-up question because I absolutely agree. Yes, I think this is actually what I was trying to get to, because so what you're talking about is gender washing, which is the promotion of gender equality with ulterior motives, right? So the kind of instrumental use of gender to promote another aim, right? And in the literature, some have written about gender washing with like based on the Rwandan example, where you have a very like autocratic government that has very successfully used gender equality to appear more democratic. So this is, and this only works because gender equality norms are so closely intertwined with democratic norms. Like we understand these as very intimate ideas, right? So, but and that also I think is really important in the Malian context because, well, you brought up the jihadists, right? That they can use this to appear different, and that I think that's really important because the authorities have a big problem with the jihadists in this sense, because the Malian authorities are not able to provide protection and services and security for a large proportion of their population, right? And we know that or as far as I know, there are no women that have engaged in direct violence but they do support the jihadists in different ways, right? Maybe through just logistics, but also ideologically. And some of the reasons for that is that in some communities the jihadists provide more security than the government, right? So this is super important, and I think a very key point to make. So thank you for doing that, for bringing that up.
Thank you. Maybe we should also mention that Laura Berlingosi
Yes.
is here as well among the participants, and she has also written quite extensively on women in jihadist or other types of non-armed state-armed groups, and so you could check out her writings as well. And now I turn for the final 3-4 minutes to
Right.
Ivan.
Yes, thank you. And just to follow up on what Jenny was just saying, she mentioned the importance of security for communities, including women, that may make women, in fact, support their own community against states that can be seen in some occasions as perpetrators of violence or atrocities. So that creates a very ambiguous logic whereby, as we said, like women under the rule imposed by the jihadists, like may not be allowed to walk alone in the public space. Recently, for example, like some bus companies have been asked by the jihadists to have like separate sections for men and women, and have demanded that women like should wear the hijab. The buses where this was not enforced have been stopped, women have been flogged. So there's violence. And then on the other side, the jihadists might offer some level of security, and they govern in ways that may seem more legitimate sometimes than what the state is doing when it comes, for example, to taxation, accountability. And there was also like sexual violence when you had a village next to a military barracks that would generate prostitution. I mean, this was morally very much despised. So the picture of like oppressions that women suffer is in fact like fairly ambiguous, and this is not to dismiss the fact, of course, that they suffer from all sorts of bans. But as you said, Laura has like written extensively on this, and I recommend that you all read her work on this information. Perhaps very quickly, I'm always super frustrated by these talks around disinformation, because We are all very well connected here in this room. We have the capacity to build massive databases of all sorts of rubbish that circulates on social media. And if we compile these things and watch them, like, we are just horrified, right? And for good reasons, because some of the claims that are being made on a daily basis by certain influencers or governments are absolutely right. Now, we don't have a full of the understanding of how these things actually travel locally. Is it through WhatsApp? Is it through Facebook? Okay, we can sort of have tools to measure these things, but how they reach the sort of end users, what the end users are going to make out of these claims, well, we're still unclear about this. So we have this sort of bias, like, because we are connected, because we see how the amount of stupid things that circulate, we have the sort of knee-jerk reaction to this without necessarily having the full understanding of how these things eventually impact behavior, which is in fact the real question to ask. And we don't have the model that explains behaviors associated with waves of disinformation. So disinformation is there, and we generally don't go much further. And I found it, like, analytically very, very frustrating. And then, yeah, differences between the three regimes when it comes to their methods of warfare. Of course, like, they have adopted very different ways of dealing with the situations. The Malians have trusted the Russians, as you said. This didn't work out very, very well. And we need to be very clear about this. The Western powers, like, failed. And by the way, in the report, we don't show any nostalgia. Huh? We try to be as, like, empirically rigorous as possible, and don't say, okay, it was better in the past. What happened in the past failed, didn't work. The Westerners have been replaced by the Russians. It's even worse today. Like, just look at the map of incidents caused by the jihadists. It's a massive expansion. So these governments and their choice to turn or elaborate a partnership with the Russians, that failed. So, but that's the Mali solution. The Burkinabe solution relies on the VDP, so the Volunteers for the Defense of Homeland, that has provoked huge social polarization, that has provoked an ethnicization of violence that is not as evident in the two other countries. And when it comes to violence perpetrated against civilians, probably Burkina Faso is the worst case right now. Niger, super complicated. They've been trying to find solutions. It's unclear whether they want to work with Turkey, whether they want to work with local actors. They're still trying to figure out their best way to deal with the insurgents. And to answer Laura's question, they're still maintaining some channels of communication open with the jihadists. Of course, they don't say so, because one of the first things that they said publicly when they seized power and removed Bazoum from power is that he betrayed the Niger people because he was in a discussion with the jihadists. They're doing the same to have their soldiers that are taken hostages, like liberated, and eventually they will have to come to some sort of dialogue-based solution, even though that somehow undermines the claim that they were making when they seized power in the first place.
Thank you. That means that we're almost ending exactly on time, even though we started a bit later, and we could have continued this seminar, I think, for another 2-3 hours, because there's so much to develop and so many things to draw from that. I've already said it, and I'll repeat it again. I do think that you should download the report and read it properly, because there are so many different. It's very rich on information. What I'm taking with me from this seminar is somehow that something that perhaps is not in the report, but it's also to adopt the language of the different regimes or of the different actors. And in the case that Jenny was mentioning, the gender washing, which we've seen, for example, with Rwanda, that's perhaps also a venue or a way in to support the women's movements in Mali, because now we're focusing on Mali specifically, because if that's the language that the military regime is taking, then it's also a language that we could support by increasing that support, like you mentioned, and a way also to contrast with the jihadist language. And as Ivan was mentioning, adopting the language of Islam is also a way to counter the jihadist propaganda and way of functioning. So again, perhaps appropriating languages of the different actors to actually counter them on their own turf is a way to contrast and to provoke debates in ways that are not too controversial. So for me, the answer to the question that this report and that this seminar asked, what are the prospects for dialogue in the Sahel? Well, the prospects remain very limited and very slim, and they're very much contextually aligned with the realities on the ground. But also, as we've seen, the realities on the ground are changing so quickly. And what we're seeing today in Mali is, and I think we should reiterate this beyond this room, when we go outside of this room, that this is an alarming development that we're seeing in Mali that could have implications for much more than just Mali about the fuel blockade. So realities are changing quickly, and that also means that prospects for dialogue are changing quickly, and that the more the pressure is on these military regimes, the more likely it is that there will be dialogue, whether that is with jihadists or whether that is with other external actors. That remains to be seen. I would like to thank, of course, the three authors of the report, but also Folke Bernadotte Academy as the organization that has made that report possible. But I would also like to thank the participants who are in the room today for going against the storm and the horrible weather in Brussels, and to be here in person, because that's always much nicer. Not to say that we don't appreciate all of the online participants, and there have been a lot of you. So thank you also to you, and I hope to see you soon again for another seminar at the Egmont. And please do download the report. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for organizing, Nina and Egmont.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.